transplant athletes. We're waiting for another guest, but these things happen with Wi-Fi. Um, if you have a body, so world transplant athletes, this is really exciting. World transplant athletes, if you have a body with a new part, you are world transplant athlete. You can follow us all over the web at World Transplant Athletes, hashtag World Transplant Athletes on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, and you're really your favorite social media platform of choice. We have a team of 18 organ recipients from 11 countries and 6 languages working behind the scenes to make content for you, fellow transplant athletes. Today, we're doing a podcast called Ask a World Transplant Athlete Anything, cycling. So if you like wheels, cycling may be the sport for you. Today, we have 2 transplant athletes, I think one right now, but a second will join us shortly, who also love bikes. Now, here's the format. I'm going to ask a few questions of guests. And if you have questions, type them into the live chat box, I think to your right. And we'll try to incorporate those in as well. Now, we only have 2 or 3 people watching. That's okay. Later, you can watch this recorded and so forth. So let's just get going. My first guest is Tamaryn Stevens from Australia. I don't see her yet on, but she's telling me she's on, so she'll be on shortly. And Nate Dunn. Nate, maybe you can tell us where you're from, your transplant, a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. So I live in Sacramento. So Sacramento is the capital of California, and I am a liver transplant athlete. We're getting some bunch of feedback there. I don't know if we're solving that yet, but yeah. So I'm a liver transplant athlete, and I had a live donor liver transplant just about 9 years ago, and I've competed in 2 different World Transplant Games, and yeah, that's me.
Nice, Nate. So great to have you. So for everyone, Tamaryn Stevens from Australia, she is having some technical difficulties, but as soon as she's able, we're going to import her right into the chat and go back from there. But let's just get going, because what we really want this conversation to be is transplant recipients anywhere in the world to have a conversation. And what we've found out in the last couple months as world transplant athletes is that people really want, our followers really want, sport specific information. So we're going to do this with cycling, track and field, swimming, bowling if we can. Volleyball's coming up. So we have a lot of really cool things going. Oh, there's Tamaryn. Hey, Tamaryn,
Hello.
How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Good. So you were just beaming in right now live. So maybe you can tell everyone your name, where you're from, a little bit about you.
Okay, hello. I'm Tamaryn. I am from Australia, and I have had a kidney transplant. Actually, I've had 2. The first one when I was about 13, and the second one just 2 years ago.
Wow. Well, congratulations for having 2 transplants. You're extra special because of it, right?
Yeah, I'll take that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. So the way what I shared with Nate, Tamaryn, is I have a list of questions for you guys. Some you've kind of seen, some you haven't, and then other guests, as they pop in, they can ask those questions, and we'll just try to feed those questions right to you. So really wanted to generate a nice conversation with 2 athletes who happen to ride bicycles. So we kind of got through the first basic questions, where you're from and so forth. But maybe Tamaryn, you first. What made you choose cycling? Why do you like to cycle? Why is that important for you?
That one for me is actually a bit of an interesting journey. So when I first got sick, I was a kid, and when you're a kid, whether you're specifically into a sport or not, you're quite active. You're running around. Obviously, that wasn't something I could do. And when you're at end stage renal failure, a lot happens in your body, including your joints and your bones. They just they become real issues. So I couldn't actually move very well at all. I had a lot of pain. I was using crutches. And once I started to become a little bit well again with my transplant, I couldn't really do much impact. So the way I started to build back muscle, because I had absolutely nothing, was to get on my little kid's mountain bike and go for rides.
All right, that's good. So it sounds like, just I'm thinking to the person who's never talked to you before or been around other recipients who are active, that maybe cycling is a really good sport for a lot of people because of the lack of impact, especially in knees and joints early on after the transplant. Was that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. It was something that I could do, and because I couldn't really walk with family or participate in that much else, if I got on my bike, as slow as I might have been, I was there, I was participating, and it didn't hurt. And the joy and the love of cycling just sort of stemmed from there.
Nice. Thanks so much, Tamaryn. So Nate, same question to you. I'm sure it's going to be a very different response, but why cycling for you?
Yeah, so I was always involved in sports and interested in training from a young age, and that's what I studied in my undergraduate degree. And so I had actually started riding a bike, and my first love was really racing. I'm probably different than most, that I would say that riding a bike is fun, but racing was really what my favorite thing was. So I had started doing that probably about 3 or 4 years before my transplant. Had kind of, I'd ridden a bike as a kid, but never a lot. So I kind of came into it after college. I wasn't as active as I was through college. I had about 1 year post college where I was like, okay, I got to figure something out. I have to have some form of more durable exercise that's not dependent on a large group or those types of like traditional ball sports. At least that are more common in the States. So I started riding a lot and racing. And so my journey was a little bit different in that I was riding, racing. And then as liver disease started to get progressively worse, it was kind of like a decline into poor health. And then at some point I came across information about the World Transplant Games, either shortly before or maybe even kind of during my hospital stay. And then that, post-transplant, then the interest in participating in that, I was so lucky to get a transplant so I could be a part of this exclusive club. And so that, kind of describes a little bit of my journey into the World Transplant Games and kind of cycling with that community.
Yeah, so 2 follow-up questions real quick, Nate. So what's interesting about Tamaryn's answer versus yours, she did it and kind of got into family community, and you wanted to have a way to do something with or without people. So that's kind of interesting. You can come into cycling for different purposes, but you talked about, you like cycling, but you really love racing. So what is it about that thrills you? Like, is there a sensation in your body? Can you describe that a little bit for people?
Yeah, I would say it's the tactical consideration of it's the combination of maximal exertion while at the same time maximal tactical consideration. And that's something that's really unique. I mean, there's other sports. Obviously, every sport has a big tactical component, but I think cycling is unique in that the characteristic of kind of aerodynamic drag means that there's a massive advantage to be afforded to the cyclist who is more tactical or more knowledgeable about good tactics. And that is something I think really unique to cycling, where your tactical understanding of cycling can account for a significant difference in maybe physical ability or level of fitness. So I think that's what always interested me most about cycling. It was kind of that cheat code where it's like, if you really know how to race your bike and you really understand tactics, you can punch way above your weight in a way that is really not possible in most other sports. And that's what always was so exciting to me, I think, about racing.
Thanks, Nate. That's awesome. Yeah, jump in, Tamaryn.
I was going to say, if I can join in the conversation, I absolutely agree with Nate. And sort of the second half of my origin story for cycling is that I also discovered sort of the world. Well, firstly, the Australian Transplant Games. I started trying to play badminton, and as a teenager, and went into where my badminton was being played, and there was this big sign, the Australian Transplant Games. I thought, what's that? That's for me. And I hadn't been introduced at all to the world of cycling in terms of the competitive side. And when I looked into going to the Transplant Games, I remember asking my mother, is there cycling? And she sort of said, I don't know. So I didn't compete the very first time, but when I got there, I met some other transplant cyclists, and one specifically said to me, you should get on your bike. You should come join us and race for us. We need more juniors. We need more women. And so that's how I got into competitive cycling as well. And I have to agree, I love racing. And I'm not the strongest rider, but I love the tactics of it. I've gotten into lots of different kinds of cycling racing, road and track. But yeah, when I'm on the bike and racing, like I feel strong because I'm sort of there with others. I've got to, do what I can to keep up. And that's a lot of tactical for me. But yeah, the love of racing is a good motivator.
Thanks, Tamaryn. So let's take about 20 steps back or so, because the person I always imagine is a person who's waking up this morning in your hometown who looks a lot like you, around the same age, and their eyes are just opening and they suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I've had a transplant, organ, heart, kidney, liver, whatever it is. And that's a monumental moment that all of us probably have experienced something like that. And I think to myself, okay, what would they like to know from someone like you guys right now? And so let's ask a few questions, sort of like the first time you got on your bike. And I know, it's going to be different because for both of you guys, which is fantastic. Are you nervous the first time you got on the bike because of your transplant? And I'll start with you, Tamaryn, and then go to you, Nate. I mean, what was your sensation? Like, gosh, do I want to do this? Do I not? I mean, how did you step through any fear you had first time you got on a bicycle after your transplant?
That's actually a really interesting question, looking at sort of my two transplant experiences. The experience when you're a child is quite different. I think in some ways they expect you to be very active. And also you're a child, you don't have that much fear. But what my children's hospital had made for me was like a kidney guard. It was just this little piece of sort of semi-solid foam that I would wear strapped over my stomach and that to me sort of eliminated a lot of fear and became a safety element, just like my helmet. And then, as again, being a child, the fear didn't come in too much. Second time, well, I'd been a cyclist for a long time, and I sort of had a system for myself of how I would reintegrate onto the bike. And I started, just on a stationary indoor trainer, just pedaling, just nothing else but pedaling. And my doctors knew me. They knew I was an active person, and I was talking to them constantly, like, when can I get on my bike? When is it safe?
Yeah.
What do I need to do to stay safe? So yeah, I think the first time I did get on, I was nervous because you've got this brand new scar, and you're being told, yes, it's okay. But the nerves are definitely there. It was just a matter of slow and steady for me.
So I think I remember a picture you might have sent me, Tamaryn, that it was actually not even a stationary bike. It was just the pedals. You just sat on a regular chair like that. You weren't even on a regular stationary bike. You just started like moving your feet a little bit. That's all you were doing, right?
Yeah, they let me do that at I think 4 weeks post my second transplant, and so I just wanted to move, and I just wanted to feel a bit like I could get there again. So that was my very first starting point.
Okay, excellent. So Nate, kind of same question for you. I mean, you've been cycling, went into transplant, came out of transplant. What were your thoughts, sensations going into riding a bicycle again?
Yeah, so kind of to one of Tamaryn's earlier points, so I had a lot of significant complications with my transplant, and about 4 or 5 days after, I had to go back in, and they had to reopen up the transplant site. So when I finally was able to come home, I had a wound vac that was kind of attached to my abdomen to kind of manage infection. And I mean, probably within a couple of days of being home, I was able to get on the stationary trainer. I set the wound vac up, just propped up on a chair. And, so there wasn't any danger. I was on a stationary trainer. So I was, in that kind of context, like what Tamaryn was talking about, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a better form of exercise for, even if you don't intend to compete, but for that initial rehab, like post-transplant, because, I had a massive scar in my abdomen. It was still incredibly painful. It was not even done, it was not even close to being done healed, but I don't think there was any danger. Being on the bike was a safe place to, but I'll never forget just the sound of my just the sound of my shoes like clipping into the pedals was like this really enjoyable thing, a little detail that you would normally not pay any attention to. But when you've been kind of shuffling around a hospital, with an IV cart, to feel your shoe push into a cleat. So yeah, that was my, and then I slowly rode a little bit more on the trainer, and then I never took the wound vac out on the bike, out on the road. So I think I must have been shortly after that, I probably started riding, and but I didn't really have that fear of falling. I must have given it enough time probably on the trainer before I got it on the road.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. So I'm thinking about a person watching you guys who, maybe just a month ago or very recently, had their transplant. And so I think the sort of takeaway is that it's an excellent therapy, no matter your status, no matter your physical abilities, to get on a stationary bike at home, with a giant wound, with whatever appendages to your body. It's okay, and you, of course, you want to take precautions, talk to your doctor, the rest of it, but, just get on something, go for a walk, whatever it is, and be active as soon as possible. So let's get to another question, kind of staying in the same ballpark, in the same kind of area, guys, where, we're really thinking about a very new, recent recipient. So I'll start with you, Nate, this time around. So how do you feel when you first started riding again? How did you feel when you started riding with people who didn't have transplants? They didn't have all this backstory and this thing attached to your body, the scar and the rest of it. How did you feel the first time around riding with non-transplant people?
I think I was fortunate because I had built this community I never even met another transplant person, so let alone a transplant person that rode a bike. So I had built this community that I raced with that were all my good friends. So when I started riding a bike again, people are like, "Oh, this is amazing, Nate's back." So it wasn't really all I wanted to do. I think in hindsight, this was probably not helpful, but all I wanted to do was, as fast as possible, get back to being in a race. I wouldn't advise that because I think that causes maybe its own problems. But so I just wasn't. I just jumped back in with my friends, and obviously there's a big limitation in terms of how much work I needed to do to get healthy again, let alone try and get strong and get fit again. But I just never, I talked to people about it. People were familiar about people knew my story in my local community, so they were just super excited to see me back. But it was more like you put a cycling jersey on and nobody cares, right? Like none of my friends are gonna. It's just like if we're riding, there's a point in the ride when they're going to leave and then we're going to get back together. Yeah. So for me personally, that was helpful. It was like, this is a transplant and this has been a big deal in my life, but then life moves on. And, and this is the new life that I want to be a part of. And so that was helpful to me to maybe think about not leaving, but moving on into this new phase of my life.
Yeah, thanks. And so what you said early on, and I'll just kind of talk about that real quick, is all the evidence coming out, and we'll be covering that in different podcasts under the World Transplant Athlete umbrella, is the importance of community to living well, but certainly within a recipient's life. I mean, so many of us feel isolated after going through these incredible journeys. And so coming out of that, with a community or not, certainly start with your community if you have one. But if you don't have one, you can connect with us, World Transplant Athletes, or lots of other groups around the world, and really understand how important that is to find someone who's had that experience. In Nate's case, he just went back to his group of friends. So Tamaryn, right. Same question for you. So what was it like for you to go ride with all these like hotshot people who've never had a transplant?
Yeah, so it was really interesting hearing Nate's perspective, because in some ways I was the exact opposite. I'd had sort of nothing to do with the wider cycling community and everything to do with the transplant cycling community. I'd really only raced in the transplant games for a long time. There was sort of a gap in my cycling sort of life where I went to uni and studied moved out of the country and into the city and was a bit intimidated to ride on my own. So I lost touch with riding in general, and then went to a World Transplant Games in 2015, and suddenly I was like racing. So for a bit of context, when I'd been in the Aussie Transplant Games, I was often the only woman in my age group, so I was only ever sort of racing against myself, which would mean everything was a time where I was just always out there on my own. In 2015, 2015, when I went to this race in Argentina for the World Transplant Games, and I'm riding and racing with other women and like doing all these things I've been hearing about, like drafting and tactics. I was like, oh, this is really fun. I want to do more of this. And a friend of mine at the Transplant Game said, if you got in with a local club and started racing, you'd probably come back really strong next time. So I thought that was an excellent idea. And I started to look into it and reach out to local clubs. And I was very nervous because, I'm not fast. And I remember sort of trying to read through what clubs were doing and racing and sort of reaching out in that very first message to the club I ended up joining and saying, I would like to race. I'm not fast, but I'd like to race. How do I do that? And they were lovely and they brought me in and so I found a wonderful community there. The part about racing with able-bodied people is really interesting. And for me, it never stops being interesting because I've had such sort of ups and downs with my health, because I've been in that community about 7 years now. And especially in terms of racing, I sort of come and go in terms of whether I'm actively participating, racing in the bunch, or off the back within 2 laps. And the folks that know me, are absolutely lovely, wonderful, and sort of happy for me to participate in any way that I can. And then the other side of it, you get people who don't know you, who are really encouraging in a different but slightly wrong way, and will say to you, oh, don't worry, a couple more races, you'll be with them. And you think to yourself, thanks. Yep, I've been here a long time. Or they treat you like you are a new rider because they assume you are because of your speed. And that's, again, it's very lovely and it's all encouraging. But it's funny sometimes to hear, like, I was like that when I started. Like, yeah.
Yeah, so what I like about that story, Tamaryn, is that, I think this is important for people who are watching and listening either today or down the line, is that what's really important is that if you don't have a community, reach out. I mean, Tamaryn reached out not knowing much, just having some faith in the universe, and it responded. So now Tamaryn's part of this really good cycling community where she is, in this case, Australia. So Tamaryn, I'll start with you this time. So now we're going from, and we kind of started off with like performance kind of questions, what we call training in the World Transplant Athletes world. And we've then went back to just basic activity. Now let's kind of go to exercise. So you have some rhythm in your cycling life. You exercise, you train, you ride, whatever it is, 3, 4, 5 times a week. But every once in a while, you get sick. Maybe it's just the flu or COVID or, whatever it is, or maybe you just have a small accident with the bike. I mean, who knows? Maybe you have a family drama in your life, and then you have to get back to it after some delay, injury, illness. What do you suggest for people to think about when you have to go back to training after being away for a while? Because that's kind of a frustrating moment for a lot of people.
It definitely is. And actually, I'm in that moment right now. I've been a little bit for the last few weeks, and I'm just starting to come out of it. So that's been 2 weeks off the bike for me, and it's frustrating, to say the least. My biggest advice is you have to start small. To throw back to what Nate said, just wanting to get back really fast. It's a hard impulse to fight. But the way I've experienced it, and the way a lot of us transplant recipients and people who have lived with chronic illness are built, is we can't fast forward. And you might get on, do one session, push yourself hard and feel good for that moment, but you'll collapse sort of in the next few days. So I'd say it's paring it right back and just starting almost exactly how I did post-transplant, and just starting with pedaling and just starting being on the bike for as long or as short as you can, no speed pressures, anything like that. And just bottom line for me is I sort of have I do have a legitimate flow chart that I follow. If I am unwell, don't ride. That needs to be the bottom line.
Okay, thanks. Nate, same question for you. So do you have any sort of advice for folks when they've had a break because of illness, whatever, going back to riding a bicycle or exercising at some level?
Yeah, so I'm not saying this to negate anything Tamaryn's saying, because I think her advice is great advice. I'm just gonna describe what's been most helpful for me, which is to move, and I'm sure Tamaryn would agree with this too, and you too, Zach. Is moving up one extra level and accepting that, like, my athletic pursuit, whatever that is, whether or not that's cycling or whether or not that's, currently I've been enjoying doing lots of strength training and weightlifting. It's never going to be a linear process, ever. And if I look at my friends and those that I compete with, and I allow myself to feel that frustration or maybe even that resentment of, like, why can't, man, my goodness, they're getting sick. They're getting some sniffles and I'm being hospitalized multiple times. And so I think for me, the most helpful thing is to develop the perspective. And through me, that's come through the process of meditation, to try and just accept that there will be days when I feel great. And then there will be days when I don't feel great. And that's okay. And that has been the most important thing for me. The rest of the training stuff about what I like, kind of like what Tamaryn talked about, is important. But for me, it's more saying, this is a great day and I feel good. And how amazing that I get this, that I've been afforded this perspective to actually know that this is amazing. Yeah. And then when the days aren't like that, is to say this will pass. And that's been my biggest challenge, because I'm not wired like that, and I think most cyclists aren't. They are most attracted to a linear view of progression that says, I ride, I train, I get ready for this event. And if you're a transplant athlete and you think that your life will look like that, it won't. It never will. And if it does look like that, then you should be even more excited because you're the only one. So
yeah, totally. Yeah. Thanks, Nate, for that. So I have my own rule of thumb when I go back to things, and I call it the rule of three. So oftentimes when I go back to my first ride, let's say, or gym, after being away from something for a while, I have a lot of adrenaline. So sometimes the first day I'm like, wow, I feel really good because I have all this adrenaline. The next day I feel horrible and awful. And I think, oh my gosh, I'm sick, I'm hurt, I have to go back to the doctor, I need to get blood work. And then I do it the third time. And the third time is somewhere between my first and my second. And I kind of use that as my own personal psychological baseline. Like, okay, let me start there in terms of assessing myself. So I kind of go with this rule of three, and that works for me. So let's get to another question. So I'm thinking again about a first-time person watching you guys. Now, let's say someone is watching and says, I've been in the hospital a month. I'm just getting out now. I would like to ride a bike, or I rode a bike when I was younger, but they don't have a bicycle. So, Nate, I'll start with you this time around. What would you recommend to a brand new person who wants to get a bicycle? Like, what kind of things should they consider? What other things should they get in addition to a bicycle? All the safety things and so forth. So what would you recommend, Nate?
Yeah, so I would offer two potential recommendations. The first one would be is that people are always selling used bikes. So almost always your best value is going to be trying to find a used bike wherever you're at. So if you're not that type of person where you feel comfortable trying to learn about bikes, then I would kind of go back to what Tamaryn said, and that is one of the really great things about cycling community is if you were to just simply know a local group in your area and send them an email and say, hi, my name is, I just had a transplant and I'm so excited about cycling, but I don't know where to start. I don't even have a bike. I guarantee you that there will be a cycling community that will say, this is so awesome. Yeah, actually, we had somebody in our club. They have an extra bike. They don't even care. You can have it. We won't even charge you for it, right? And they will be your local resource to kind of pour resources, time and money into you to help you along to kind of join this cycling journey. So I can say that with confidence in the Sacramento area. Every cycling area that I've known, there are people there that would be excited to kind of help you in that process.
Cool. Thanks. What about you, Tamaryn? What would you suggest for a brand new person who says, "Hey, I'd like to try cycling"?
Yeah, actually, I'd absolutely agree with Nate. Reach out to the wider community. Again, I can think of more than 4 clubs and organizations here that have loaner bikes, especially track bikes, for people wanting to start. So that's always a great way to do it. Reach out to family as well. So if you're really not sure what type of cycling you want to do, and you've got family who have a disused bike, as long as it's safe, reach out family and friends. And then if you do get to the stage of sort of, you decided you like this, you want to get a bike, I'd sort of say it would be nice and to get yourself a versatile bike, something that you can use for a lot of different purposes. And again, we're thinking cycling at the moment in terms of the World Transplant Games, which is road, but there's so many other wonderful things you can do: mountain biking, gravel. If you're looking at going into sort of racing that you can do in the World Transplant Games, then something drop bar, but something that you can put wider tires on and go explore. Because once you enter sort of the cycling community and the world of cycling, you'll find that there is actually so much to do, aside from competitiveness and aside from racing. So if you end up sort of looking for one bike, set yourself up with something that you can have multiple experiences on, is my thought.
Excellent. So my own suggestion is that go to a bike shop and use it as a speed dating experience. Walk in, see how you feel, see how the people greet you. If they don't greet you in a way that you feel comfortable, do a 180 and go to the next bike shop, because you can find a bike shop in your area that you probably feel really comfortable in. I mean, some bike shops I love, my friends hate, and vice versa, but my friends love those bike shops because they like the guy or the girl who's helping them out and servicing their bicycle, the rest of it. You can also go to a local bike shop and find someone who can really help you get on a bike, and oftentimes they have suggestions for used bikes. So let's get to another question or two before we end up here. So maybe Nate, I'll start with you this time. So what was you probably have a lot of them, but what was one of your best experiences on a bicycle post-transplant?
So both of the World Transplant Games were incredible experiences. Easily some of the best experiences that I've had. But I think my best experience probably it predates the World Transplant. Well, the connection to it predates that, because I had kind of competitive goals for myself that I wanted to reach kind of in my local area. And so probably, winning a couple kind of able-bodied races in my local area. The experience, it wasn't that the experience was necessarily a peak experience, but I guess it was what it meant to me personally. So that was very different than the World Transplant Games. That was a different thing kind of entirely. So I wouldn't even really compare them. So I would say some combination of the World Transplant Games, which is it's an entirely different thing, and then the experience of kind of meeting some competitive objectives that had always been important to me. And having done that post-transplant was like it will always remain one of my proudest moments personally.
Can you talk us through that a little bit more, Nate? Like, what specifically were you trying to do, and what was that sensation? Like, where in the body, where in the mind, how long did it last? Like, talk us through that.
Yeah.
That joy.
Well, again, I can't say that this is healthy. It's just me. But for me, the transplant experience has also been a bit of a chip on my shoulder about, like, when I come to a race, or when I would come to race, it'd be like, yeah, I just beat you. And, I was in the hospital just a couple months ago. And that, again, I'm not advising that, I'm not advising that people take that, upon themselves. But I think that the fact that I was able to attain a level of health and competitiveness on the bike post-transplant that exceeded where I was before the transplant was a monumental achievement for me. And I don't don't know why it was so important to me. I look back on it, and I'm at a different place in life now to where that's not so important to me to do that again. But I think it was somehow something I needed to buttress the pain and suffering that the transplant really was. It was not easy for me, as it's not for many people. And so I think that, I don't know, somehow it validated that in a way that maybe I'll keep trying to understand.
Okay.
But yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does. So Tamaryn, do you have a one or two post-transplant bike rides that stand out?
Well, there was one that absolutely sprung to mind, which I'll come to in 1 second. I was going to say, a lot of the time I get hit with it. And it's a really nice feeling, and I probably bug my friends because all of a sudden we'll be riding along and I'm like, isn't this just so pretty? Isn't life just so good? Don't you love being here? And that happens a lot. And sometimes I say it like 10 times in quick succession, like, sorry guys, I'm just having a moment. But yeah, I mean, it happens to me in those little rides with friends. And I do admit also there was one race a long time ago now, well, 4 years ago, where I did manage to win an able-bodied race, and that was quite nice too. But actually, the one that immediately sprung to mind is a very, very little moment. And it was at the World Transplant Games, but it wasn't within the race. So race day had passed. You know, we'd done all the big competitive, nerve-wracking stuff. I'd hit a goal that I was really happy with, you know, on my age group. And a friend of mine, we just went out riding in Spain. And we had no maps. We had no computer. We just sort of knew as long as we kept the ocean in sight, we could get back to our hotel. And we ended up on so many dead ends, so many people's driveways, but in this just beautiful place. And when we finally sort of gave up, quote unquote, on this ride was when we'd, you know, gone up this very steep gravel climb that eventually ended up turning to sand. And, you know, we were on our race bikes and race wheels, so we couldn't go any further. And we've eventually realized that's a driveway too, even though it's been, you know, 4 kilometers. But at that moment, you know, when it's turned to stand and we're realizing, yep, we need to turn around, you did turn around and you're up top of this mountain with like olive trees, and you can see the ocean and you can see these castles. And, you know, I'm here in Australia, we don't have many old buildings at all. And then, you know, we came back, we finished that ride riding up alongside a castle, and it was just a moment of, I wouldn't actually be here without this. You know, I you know, understand everything Nate's saying, and every now and then, you know, I have the moments of frustration of, you know, why did this happen? But you know what? There are some really nice moments that I wouldn't have gotten without it. And that's one that springs to mind.
Yeah, so from both of you guys, like what I'm kind of synthesizing, and this is coming from having written a self-help book, Discovering Your Human Algorithm, How to Live Life with Meaning and Purpose, is like, you know, we strive for certain goals in life, and we achieve those goals and they're wonderful, or we don't, and that's also okay. But it's oftentimes a striving for something, but it's an off-target, you know, experience or moment that actually is the most meaningful. And we don't necessarily have logical reasons why that's meaningful, but nonetheless it is. So I think the important thing for anyone listening is that, you know, it's good to get on your bike or walk or hike or play volleyball, whatever the sport is, and enjoy it, you know, push yourself, but really be open to these really incredible other experiences, especially, you know, after a life-saving organ transplant. So with just a few minutes remaining, Nate, any sort of final thoughts for someone who's watching this, a recent transplant, you know, recipient, or even maybe a couple years, who is just thinking about exercise in general or cycling more specifically, which is what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, for me, I remember sitting in the hospital and reading about the World Transplant Games. That year that I had my transplant, it was in South Africa. I think that was the first year. And I remember reading as much as I could about the race course, you know, the experience that different people had. And that was really motivating to me. It was motivating to kind of have that as a return target. And so that was fun, and it was fun to participate in that. But it was also really meaningful to be around a community like that. Most of my life, I have never been involved in any of the transplant community at a local level. So I just kind of showed up to these events and I was like, wow, this is really cool. And then I went home and so I would just make a pitch for, obviously we're talking about cycling as kind of being a conduit back to better health. But whatever it is, if it's cycling or if it's some other thing, I think that for me personally, as somebody who avoided all of the social contact in the transplant world beforehand, it was really meaningful to process some of that with people that were I felt were maybe more like-minded to me in that community. And so that would just be my pitch, is that if you have any interest in that, we're talking about cycling, but whatever it is, it can be. I think participating in that community can give an extra layer of perspective to your transplant that, for me at least, was impossible to gain at the smaller level of me just going through the own things, my own things I was going through. So that's my advertisement. That's my pitch to go. And it doesn't mean you have to do it forever, but to seek one out and to try and be a part of it.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Tamaryn, any sort of final thoughts for someone watching this, for a brand new person to transplantation and/or sports or cycling?
Yeah, so I'll sort of separate them. The first one is on the transplant community. I sort of agree with Nate. It's a wonderful thing to be part of when you can find your people within it, and in terms of people who participate in sport and have a transplant, that's where I've definitely found my people in it. There's something beautiful about not having to explain yourself at all, and a sort of unspoken bond there. Going back to sort of what I said, when I do participate in standard races or even standard groups, sometimes when you're off the back and things like that, or with a group and getting dropped, it's a question of, do you explain yourself and when? And there's that added sort of burden and pressure. Transplant community, that's not something you have to do, and it's quite lovely. And then for cycling, my pitch is, it's just a wonderful, you'll be surprised how much of a community there is out there, and how wonderful that can be in terms of helping support you in your exercise and the friendships you'll gain. I'm incredibly lucky. I've got an amazing bunch of friends around me. So yeah, as I said, I'm going through quite a rough patch at the moment. I'm hoping that towards the end of this week, I'm going to be able to restart my own sort of training. And I've reached out to friends and said, hey, do you want to ride? Just warning, I'm unwell. Well, I'm coming off being unwell. I've got maybe an upper limit of 15 Ks at the moment, and I will be slow. Who's up for that? And I've actually, people jump in, even as tiny as that might be. So the community that you build is wonderful. And I've got friends who, I know that I can reach out to ride with, even when I'm at my worst, and still feel not isolated, and there are people around who want to ride with me, and it's lovely.
Thanks so much, Tamaryn. Thanks so much. So we're out of time, everyone, but I'd like to thank Tamaryn and Nate. This is Zach Brooks, 2-time kidney transplant recipient. If you have a body with a new part, you are a world transplant athlete. You can follow us at World Transplant Athletes on Instagram, Facebook, and everywhere else. Follow us because we like to communicate with people around the world all the time. This is your transplant family online. Thank you so much, guys, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.